Welcome to part two of my grandfather's story. You've already seen this one if you've seen part one. If not, go back and you'll learn more about that photo and so on. And just a reminder that my interest in my grandfather's story started when these photos appeared in a New Zealand magazine, and quite dramatic and confronting photos, as you can imagine. And there's what my grandfather looked like before he was wounded. Now, I have a little bit of a digression in telling you the story, but it's a good digression and it leads to a very interesting place in the Great War story of my grandfather. And this particular story begins with the marriage of my parents in Wellington, New Zealand. There's my father, there's my mother, and to the left is my dad's mother, and to the right is my grandfather who was in World War II. In the middle, that's actually a still from a colour film that was taken of their wedding, and just pretty typical wedding photos in April of 1960 in New Zealand's capital. Now, this particular photo as they leave the wedding is important to this story because you'll see they have a guard of honour. On the left, there's a whole bunch of boys in the Boys Brigade, and on the right, there are various girls in the Girls Brigade. And this is part of how my parents met. My mother was very involved as an adult helping with the Girls Brigade, and my father with the Boys Brigade. In fact, the whole story of how my father came to New Zealand from Wales is a story of the Boys Brigade. He belonged to the Boys Brigade all through his youth. There he is on the left. And in the 1950s, he represented Wales as an officer in the Boys Brigade at an international camp in New Zealand. That was how he came out. When I went to Wales and I asked some of his old friends, how long did you think he'd be gone? They replied, oh, about a 12-month. That was how they expressed it in Wales. So my father was a Welshman, and it was the Boys Brigade that brought him to New Zealand. And it was also the Boys Brigade that controlled the next chapter of his life, because after they got married, my father had got a job with the Boys Brigade in Auckland. So Mum and Dad moved from the capital, Wellington, up to Auckland, and there's it's a photo of one of Dad's badges from the Boys Brigade, sure and steadfast. Now, my grandmother had passed away just about 6 weeks before my parents got married. So sadly, she wasn't there, and this also has an impact on what happens next. Let's stop here. Because Granddad had just seen his youngest daughter married off. He had just lost his wife, and he didn't have much to do. So he thought he would take a trip up to Auckland on the train, and he could also help take a bunch of the wedding presents with them, because when Mum and Dad had moved from Wellington to Auckland, they hadn't had room to take everything. So he went up to visit them. Now, because my father was working with the Boys Brigade, he was obliged to attend a major Boys Brigade event that happened soon after he arrived when Granddad was visiting. It was a memorial service for a company captain who had been really important in the lives of many boys in the Boys Brigade for many years. Dad didn't know who he was, but he was obliged to attend. So Mum, his new bride, went along with him. And since Granddad was visiting, Granddad thought, oh, well, what am I going to do? Hang around the house on my own? So Granddad went along with them to Greenlane Presbyterian Church to attend the memorial service for James Thomas Smallbone, or J.T. Smallbone, as he was known at the time. And I actually found, as you can see, Jimmy Smallbone's certificate of death. And you can see here that he died on the 10th of July 1960. So the story lines up rather well. Now, when Granddad, again back to that last slide, when Granddad was sitting in this memorial service, and he's listening to the people describe this company captain who had passed away, as Granddad is listening, he turns to Mum and Dad and he says, I know this man. That was Jimmy Smallbone. This is the man who saved my life in World War I when I was shot through the face. And remember, he was not somebody who normally talked about his experiences in World War I. But somehow, fate, or whatever you want to call it, had brought Granddad to Auckland and brought him to attend a memorial service for the man who had saved his life in 1918, which I have to say, if I'd love it one day if somebody decided to make a TV series of my grandfather's life. And this, if you like, would be the opening scene. The movie Saving Private Ryan, where they start, at a graveyard, and the guy's looking at the graves of all the people who passed away, and that sparks all his recollections of the war. Well, for me, this would be my opening scene. Granddad at this memorial service, listening to people talk about this man and realizing this is the man who saved my life in World War One, and then that would start all the recollections going, well, similar to the movie Saving Private Ryan. Now, what did Grandad remember about Jimmy Smallbone? Well, this is what he told my parents. He was a short fellow. He was a Cockney from England. He jumped ship in New Zealand. He was a kitchen hand in the company. He was a ne'er-do-well. He was always getting into trouble, getting up to no good, facing discipline issues. But he saved my life, so said Grandad, and he dragged him back to safety. Now, I was able to find Jimmy Smallbone's World War One file because I have a rule of thumb: never trust family stories. There's always traditions and exaggerations and memories that aren't quite correct and things like this. So I thought, can I check how much of this is true? And we have here copies from little chunks of Smallbone's file. He was 5'2" and weighed 133 pounds. Well, a small little guy. Also, Grandad, I think, was 5'6", not exactly tall by today's standards. I think it was fairly average at the time, but nevertheless, a guy who was only 5'2" and 133 pounds, having to drag him back to safety, that would have taken some effort. He was born in London, England. Well, it doesn't prove he was Cockney, but it is in the right general area. What was his former occupation before he signed up as a soldier? He was a seaman with the Union Steamship Company. Well, again, it doesn't prove that he jumped ship, but it definitely shows he had some experience in the merchant marine. And that he was a kitchen hand. Well, he was appointed company cook on the 10th of October 1918. And on his conduct sheet has several punishments. Well, only 3, which honestly is not that bad. Interestingly, you can see the first offence, it doesn't even tell us what he did, but he forfeited 2 days' pay. So it obviously wasn't anything that serious. The second offence, he just overstayed his leave. He was late coming back, and he was fined 3 days' pay and confined to barracks for 6 days. So again, somewhat more serious, but not really that bad. And the last one in 1919, he also overstayed his leave, and he was fined. He was confined 6 days' pay this time, and well, that was it. So I guess it sort of confirms he was a guy who got into a bit of trouble, but at least as far as his conduct sheet is concerned, not too bad. Now, the final little interesting thing, he was appointed company cook on the 10th of October. Now, my grandfather was shot through the face on the 8th of October, and it was then that Jimmy Smallbone had saved his life. And I couldn't help wondering by looking at that date. Just 2 days later, he gets a promotion. He's appointed cook, goes from a kitchen hand to company cook. Well, again, the way the British Army worked, guys like this, you wouldn't tend to give them medals, but I can't help feeling that this was some kind of reward for his act of bravery in saving my grandfather's life. Now, there is the photo of Jimmy Smallbone. Now, the man standing on the left is a family friend, and he was a boy in the Boys Brigade and had J.T. Smallbone, as he called him, as his company captain and remembered him with affection. And he managed to dig through his old photo collection and find a photo of him standing with Jimmy Smallbone at his 21st birthday party. Now, I think even as an old man, he'd shrunk a bit because the man on the left is shorter than I am, and I'm not that tall. And so Jimmy Smallbone was a small man, no doubt about it. And I also found some other interesting things about him. The name of his wife, Mabel, and that they'd been married in 1907. And you can see that Mabel already had a kid. that initially they'd written down that the kid was born after the marriage, but then you can see the corrections in the red pen. Harold Hilditch. That's the name of the last name of his mother. It's not Smallbone. So I guess Jimmy Smallbone had taken on um, not just a new wife, but a new wife who already had a child, and so he raised a stepson as well. Just sort of interesting little details you learn about somebody when you start researching them. Now, Jimmy Smallbone and my grandfather had been in the New Zealand Machine Gun Battalion. This photo on the right, I think it came from the Auckland War Memorial Museum or possibly the National Library of New Zealand. I can't remember where I got it. Shows the New Zealand Prime Minister Massey visiting the troops in France and a couple of soldiers of the Machine Gun Battalion demonstrating their gun to him. So that's the kind of uniform that my grandfather and Jimmy Smallbone would have worn, and well, that's the kind of equipment and stuff they had to handle. Now, I thought, what else can I check out to try and research this story? So Jimmy Smallbone was a cook. What did that involve? Well, as you can see here, there's a photo from 1918, not that long after my grandfather was wounded, in fact, showing a bunch of New Zealand soldiers cooking up a meal for the boys at the front. And the reason I particularly mention that is because I stumbled on another interesting little detail, because I have now the detail that my grandfather was wounded on October the 8th. And there are these documents that are a complete list of all New Zealand soldiers reported as casualties, killed or wounded throughout the entire war. And you can go and look them up by their units and by their rough dates. And you can see here in the Machine Gun Corps, here is a list of an awful lot of men who had been wounded at different times. And I found my grandfather, sure enough, Fowler, RB, and his wound was reported a couple of weeks after he received it, so the 23rd of October. And I wanted to know more about the circumstances, how he got wounded. And I thought one of the ways I could approach this, I could try and look up the military files of all of the other men who were wounded in the same battle. Now, how on earth would you identify that? Well, I thought I'll go through all of these casualty lists and I'll find all of the men in the machine gun corps whose wounds were reported plus or minus 2 days, like from the 21st of October to the 25th of October, and I'll pull their military files and have a look at them. And I managed to find 39 other men. And I found a number of interesting stories, some of which I plan to share in later videos. But I also found out, while doing this, the reason why Jimmy Smallbone could be promoted to company cook. What happened to the existing company cook that opened up a vacancy for him? One other thing I want to point out before I move on from this particular PowerPoint slide is that you can see what unit they were, not the unit, but how they came to the war. You see almost all the other men are 5th reinforcements, 15th reinforcements. There are only 2 men on either of these pages who have a different listing, and they're listed as main body and main body. Now, this was a name given to the group of roughly 10,000 New Zealanders who were the first batch of men to leave for war in October of 1914. And I've even seen comments of people writing in 1918, there aren't many main body men left, so everybody would have known there was something special about these 2 men you see on the page, this guy Campion and my grandfather Fowler, that they were the originals. They were part of the very first contingent to leave for war. Now, I want to talk to you now about George Alfred Symons, service number 20260. And he did survive the war, I was pleased to see. It's always nice when you can look ahead in these guys' military files and see if they made it. And you can see here, he was the company cook. In fact, I know from other research I'm not mentioning here that he was the company cook of my grandfather's company. And back in March of 1917, he had been promoted. And this picture on the right by this guy Cumberworth, he actually was in the New Zealand Machine Gun Battalion. So it's quite possible that one of the men that he's showing in this picture actually was George Symons. And you can see here, wounded in action, 9th of October, that's one day after my grandfather, and he is admitted to the CCS, that's the Casualty Clearing Station, on the 10th of October, gunshot wound to his ankle. So the company cook has been wounded and taken out of action. That's why there's a vacancy. That's why Jimmy Smallbone could be promoted to company cook. Doesn't eliminate the possibility that it was a reward for saving my grandfather's life, but it explains why there was a vacancy. Now, most of the time when you pull these guys' military files, they're not that interesting. There's only so much stuff in it. But every now and again you get a file and you find something interesting. And this was the case in the file of George Symons, because there was this whole bunch of documents in it that you didn't normally see. And I'll just summarize briefly what it is. He sprained his left ankle. It was severe. While on duty carrying a boiler over icy ground, he slipped and sprained his ankle. Signed statement from a private Brockenbank attached. And then commanding officer's opinion. Was this in the performance of his military duty? Yes, it was. Was he to blame? No. Was any other person to blame? No. Signed by his captain. And then still further down at the bottom, signed by major, even higher up the chain of command, accidental. Soldier was in execution of his duty. No action. Why all this stuff? And I can tell you from personal experience that injuring your ankle is not pretty, and it can be pretty debilitating. That is not a photo of Symons' ankle. That's a photo of my ankle when I had a minor break in my ankle, and it was at the ankle, but you can see what the impact was all over my foot. And here's some of the stuff that was in the file. While on duty on the morning of the 24th of December 1917, I was walking along the frosty ground where I slipped and fell, injuring my left ankle, which had previously been sprained some days before. Noted, this 26th day of December 1917. Signed, George Symons. And then one of the other witness statements. On the morning of the 24th of December 1917, I was carrying a copper into the cookhouse, assisted by 20260 Private G.A. Symons, when he slipped on some ice and fell, spraining his ankle. And hence we get all of this write-up that it was in the performance of his duty. He wasn't to blame for it. It was completely accidental. And this got me thinking, what's going on here? And, well, before that, let's just finish the story of what happened to him when he got injured and taken out of action in October. So Christmas Eve 1917, he'd injured his left ankle. And I actually found a mistake in the reports, because you see gunshot wound, ankle right. It was wrong. It was his left, as you can see from the later medical reports. Gunshot wound of left leg with comminuted fracture of the tibia, wound excised, counter drainage, no foreign bodies removed, etc., etc. And just so you know, they're talking about fracture of the tibia. Well, there's the tibia on the left. And this particular type of fracture is not just a single crack. It's where it's been broken in multiple points. So he had in fact been quite seriously injured. And isn't it sort of the funny way you get injured in one place, his poor left ankle, and later on he gets shot through exactly the same ankle. Somehow that ankle was cursed. I'm sure he would have had a limp for the rest of his life. Now, moving back to why all this investigation, why requirement of an eyewitness report and all the rest? Well, I pulled up some of the routine battalion orders for the New Zealand machine gunners. Now, these all come from 1918, so after Christmas Eve 1917, but I think they're highly relevant. We have here, for example, self-inflicted and accidental wounds. The attention of all officers is drawn to the instructions printed on the back of AFW 3428, issued with battalion orders. These instructions must be fully complied with and must be rendered immediately in every case of self-inflicted wounds or accidental injuries. The instructions in paragraph 3 will be strictly adhered to. Self-inflicted wounds. You know, we all know these stories of soldiers in war shooting themselves in the foot or the hand just to get out of action. You can see they're paying attention to it. Here's another one. Self-inflicted injuries. In future, where there is reason to suppose that a soldier is suffering from the effects of gas through carelessness, disobedience of orders, culpable negligence, or drinking or washing in water, knowing it to be so contaminated, or in contravention of orders, the case will be investigated and subject to, self-inflicted wounds treatment. But on the other hand, they weren't as cruel as you might imagine. They weren't saying, well, you're too bad, you're sick, get back in the trenches, because I found this one. Company commanders will render to the battalion orderly room by 6 p.m. on the 13th a return showing the names and particulars of all men who are unfit for trench service, with a view to having them classified. So in other words, if you do have men who are unfit, report them so we can actually bring them out. But at the same time, they're not being overly soft. Sick parade. All men who parade sick and who are excused duty, also light duty men, become automatically CB, which is confined to barracks, and as such will not leave the camp without permission of their company commander. So yes, if you're sick, we will take you out of the front line, but you can't just go off and enjoy yourself. You're confined to barracks. And while I was researching self-inflicted wounds, I found some images of people selling these armbands that patients in hospital were required to wear if they were in hospital with what had been judged to be self-inflicted wounds, the infamous SIW armband. So everybody knew they were a malingering coward who tried to get out of action. But fortunately, George Symons was not one of those. And that's all I've got